There were 8 draws in the 8th round of the Moscow Grand Prix, and the one decisive game was Pentala Harikrishna's victory over Ian Nepomniachtchi. Nepo had the white pieces, and he started with c4. Harikrishna played knight f6, and we see a line that has appeared many times at high-level play. So in this variation, the knights are traded by pawn captures and not directly by trading via one another. And after ef6, dc3, bc3, queen f6, white has these double pawns, but they're actually quite strong because they help support the center. d4, e5 is played to try to break that pawn mass, and knight f3. After ed4, bishop g5, this strong intermezzo allows white to recapture the pawn eventually, but get development in first. And after queen e6 check, bishop e2, d takes c3 of course is impossible because queen d8 is checkmate in 1. And if not for d takes c3, if you want to make another pawn move with d3, you do leave white with these double isolated c-pawns, but they're not at all weak. And in fact, after queen takes d3, white is so far ahead in development that he has a humongous advantage. So after bishop e2, bishop e7, c d4, take on g5, knight g5, queen g6, f4, defending the knight and occupying more central squares. h6 would ideally be played here, except for the fact that bishop to h5 hits the queen and wins the pawn on f7, so that would be devastating for black. So after f4, both sides castle, and now knight to c6 and rook b1. In previous games, the move d5 has been played, and white does get a bit of an advantage, but black has done quite well to hold, as was seen in the game between Boris Grachev and Radoslav Wojtaszek. In this one, Nepo chose what I believe is a new move with rook to b1, and after h6, knight f3, queen to d6. Okay, Harikrishna is hitting central pawns. Now white continues with d5, knight e7, and played knight to d4. Queen d4 might be tempting, eventually trying to play a move like c5 or offer a queen trade via e5 at the right moment, but the problem is black simply plays b6, which means the b7 pawn is no longer a target. The bishop can choose which diagonal to develop on, and knight f5 will come with a tempo, hitting the queen on d4 and trying to make use of the softened square e3. That pawn on f4, if it were on f2, it would defend that square, but of course here it doesn't. So after knight e7, knight d4, c6, chiseling away at the white center. Now, d takes c6 would just be equal, and so Nepo was not looking to trade off these pieces and play something like this where a draw could be called in a few moves. Instead, the ambitious Nepo played f5. So if you take on d5 here, now white goes f6, and we see the horrendous problem with the black position. You have won a pawn temporarily and even a second after g takes f6, but your position is pried open, the king side is blasted, and this rook can now come from b3 over to the king side, which allows white to have a huge attack. So instead, after f5, queen f6 was played, stopping this idea, and after knight e6, which is a pretty surprising move, black is doing more than fine. Rook e8, of course, would be a blunder trying to save the rook because knight c7 actually forks both of them. So f takes e6, best move, f takes e6, and now knight f5 could be played here. I understand the reluctance to play such a move. You're putting your knight directly in a pin. But after bishop d3, for starters you can consider queen e5 with immense complications, but you can also give back the material in a timely fashion with bishop e6, pawn e6, queen takes e6. Now everything is guarded, and even if material equality is restored after rook takes b7, black is to be slightly preferred. So that was one option. Instead, after f e6, it looks like Hari wanted more, and so he played queen to e5. But after rook takes f8, king f8, queen f1 check, now black really has nothing better, objectively speaking, than playing king to g8, and allowing what should be a draw in short order, because after queen f7 check, you pick up this knight on e7, and then after queen takes e2, there's queen f8 check. I can make a draw immediately, but let's say white tries to win with rook to f1. Well, nothing is happening for white because after check, queen e4, let's say rook g1 just to defend the g2 square, and after cd5 you finally get e7, and it looks like you're picking up this rook on a8 because it's the only way to prevent white from queening, but bishop h3 is just in time. And this is thematic. Queen takes a8, bishop g2, rook takes g2, and now this draw is by making a pendulum from these squares, is that white can do nothing better than shuffle the rook between g1 and g2, and the game is a draw. But scrolling back after queen f1, queen f6, which makes sense, completely understandable, offering an exchange of queens when you're up material, in this case a minor piece for a pawn. But the move d6, look at those white pawns. You may only have one pawn for the piece, but they're so far advanced that they're more than enough compensation. In fact, bishop takes e6, trying to restore the equality materially, doesn't work out because after take on e7, rook takes b7 check, the king has to drop back, and now queen f6, gf6. Yes, there's 4 pawns, a bishop and rook each, but the white rook is in the 7th rank, cutting off the black king. Not to mention the fact that white has connected pawns on the king sides, which means they can defend one another, whereas black has split pawns across the board. And so these are very weak pawns, and with the king cut off and unable to join the protection, white is much, much better. So instead of this, Hari played b6, and now bishop g4, very strong move. You can capture the knight on e7, but instead you keep up the initiative. You make black's task very difficult, and this is objectively the best move. Knight g6 was played, and now d7 would have ended the game very soon. Because after d7, if you try to keep your bishop with bishop b7, queen d3 comes, and now there are so many threats. Rook f1, queen d6 check. Of course, this pawn is 1 square away from promoting, and black is actually just lost. If after d7 you chose bishop d7, well, I capture here, and after knight e5, trying to get your knight into the game, simply queen e2. Now rook f1 is still a deadly threat with a pin. This pawn on d7 still exists, so black is just in big trouble. So after knight g6, rook e1 was played. Okay, I understand why it was played, rook behind the pawn, but now bishop takes e6, a timely return of the extra material. If rook takes e6, well, this is actually not very much in white's favor, because king f7, it protects the knight on g6, it keeps the bishop tied down to the rook on e6, the e7 square is protected by the knight on g6, and black is 1 move away from swinging his rook into the action and holding the balance. So after bishop e6, bishop takes e6 was played, and now rook d8, so trying to get at this pawn on d6. Here, white missed a great opportunity. c5, an excellent move. It really clears space while protecting the pawn on d6 is what it does right now. It actually, if you capture on c5, the point is queen to c4. Once again, rook f1 is a really deadly threat. And you're not in time to trade queens with queen d4 check, because after queen d4, pawn d4, rook f1 check, king e8, bishop f7 check scoops up the knight on g6, and the extra material is winning. So after rook d8, white instead played g3, so he made a mistake. And now after rook takes d6, black is up a pawn, but white should now force a draw after queen e2 was played, queen c3, and now the move to play was queen f2 check, but allowing queen f6 and back to e2. With a draw, the position would be repeated. Instead, Nepo blundered, king to h1. He was probably trying to win this game still and avoiding any checks in the dark squares. But there's a problem here. Rook to d2, rook f1 check, and now king to e7. Rook f7 check looks like it might be launching a big attack, but I'll leave you to figure out why this is not so deadly, and in fact, black is still very much on top. So instead, after king e7, queen e4, keeping discovered checks alive, knight e5, simultaneously blocking a discovered check and defending this very critical f7 square. So bishop h3, king d6, nice move. The king is actually quite safe here. Queen f5 and king to c5. Amazing. The king ran from f8 over to c5 and is actually very safe on the queen side. Bishop g2 and now queen d4. Instead, king b4 was better, making the full run. The king is very, very, very safe on the queen side because the king can find shelter on a5, or once some of these pawns get captured, perhaps it can even go to a3. Bishop g2, queen d4, and the problem with this move is now rook f4 would have saved the day. If rook d1 check, bishop f1, sure there's a pin on that bishop, queen e3 is necessary, rook e4 here would be a big blunder. It looks like it wins the knight on e5, but rook takes f1 check, distracts the queen away, and I go up a piece as black. But after bishop f1, queen e3, now the move queen f8 check, you have to block with the rook on d6, and black's forces are discombobulated, and so the position is quite complex. Sure, black is up one pawn, but this pawn is also under attack, and this king is not very safe. So rook f4 was the way to keep fighting. Now after queen f8, queen d6, we see the position repeat itself a few times, but after queen f4, now rook to e2, a very smart move. Knight takes c4 was possible, but if you're black, you don't really want to open up another file for the white rook to attack. So after queen f4, rook to e2 makes a lot of sense. It defends this knight on e5 and also supports this queen coming to infiltrate on the second rank. So queen c1 was played, queen d3, safeguarding this a3 square, and after queen f4, g5, an excellent move, kicking the queen from f4. And the point of the queen on f4 is it both defends c4 and hits the knight on e5 and keeps black uncomfortable. But now after queen f8 check, queen d6, queen f5, queen comes to d2, and bishop takes c6, a last-ditch effort. If black were to make a horrendous blunder with king takes c6, white actually wins. Queen c8 check, king d6, and rook f6 check is deadly. The king has to run to e7, but as we see, that king is going to get checkmated quite soon, and so that would be a really tragic oversight if you were Harikrishna. So instead, after bishop takes c6, this desperado, rook takes h2 check, king g1, and rook back to e2. So black is up a pawn, his king is surprisingly safe, and after bishop b7, keeping the bishop on the board, queen e3 check, king a2, and now rook takes a2 is very good objectively, but why take any risks? Rook e1 is just very easy. Trading the rooks, without that rook on the board, white has no hopes of an attack, and as we see in the game, queen f8 check, the king comes to d4, queen d6, king c3, queen a3 check, king c2. If queen a4 check were played, the king reaches a promotion square to c1, and there is not a single check that is useful for white on the board. Black is currently up one pawn, will quickly go up at least another, not to mention the fact that this king is in grave danger. So instead, after king c2, white traded, but the game is over at this point. Rook takes e3, rook f2 check, king c3. Here comes the second pawn, and actually white resigned after knight e3 check, because if you go to the final rank, you're just completely lost. But this pawn is under attack. If you go up to protect it, simply knight d5 check is very easy. You trade rooks, you're up 2 pawns. The conversion has no difficulties whatsoever. So what to make of this game? Well, both sides had their chances. At first, it was Nepo going absolutely crazy, trying desperately to make something happen. Harikrishna could have let the game liquidate into a draw. Instead, he tried to fight on. Nepo missed his shot with those advanced pawns to create a decisive edge, and after those pawns were stopped, the material was given back, that extra material. Harikrishna did very well to convert his advantage into a win. So I hope you enjoyed that game. That's from round 8 of the Moscow Grand Prix.